Today's story is The Cliff by Alysha Wilson. Dylan ran, the wet ground slipping under his tennis shoes as he flew by. The trees seemed to jump out at him as he ran through the woods. Branches sliced his arms and legs, but he ignored the stinging. Behind him, he could hear the monster crashing through the brush, growling as it moved. Glowing eyes pierced through the night, meeting Dylan's every time he glanced over his shoulder. Upping his speed, he turned to look where he was going. He remembered how, in science class, they had said if something was chasing you, you should run in a zigzag pattern. It only seemed to slow him down as he waved back and forth, trying desperately not to trip over dead trees. The creature didn't even change its progression, creeping along behind him like it was slowly waiting for him to wear out. He couldn't see what it actually was. He could see the glowing red eyes, the big black shadow-like body. He could hear it snapping trees as it went past, shoving its way through. Dylan thought it would be safer where the trees were tightly grouped together. The spaces between would be big enough for a man, but not for the thing behind him. So he suddenly veered left, tripping and falling into a trunk, but bouncing back up and crashing into the most dense area of the forest. Still, it came for him, shoving its shoulders into the trees, knocking them to the ground like they weighed nothing. Dylan's heart raced, pounding in his ears and threatening to make him faint. He tried to steady his breath as he moved. In this part of the woods, he couldn't run near as quickly. Obstacles lined his path, and he tripped with almost every step. The creature began to gain ground on him, bumbling through like an angry hippo. As it got closer, the man could feel the ground beneath his feet shake. Boom, boom, boom. The shaking knocked him to the ground, causing him to hit his head on a nearby rock. Blood instantly trickled from the wound, and his vision started to go fuzzy. Still trying to get away, Dylan began crawling into what appeared to be a small clearing. The second his feet were out of the trees, and his body was in the meadow, the ground stilled again. Frantically, he pulled himself up and looked around. No red eyes waited for him. No crashing trees, no booming steps. In front of him, at the end of the clearing, the ground suddenly dropped, revealing a large canyon. Dylan's vision cleared, and he walked over to the cliff peeking over the edge. In the darkness, he couldn't tell how far it went down. He picked up a pebble and dropped it, listening for it to hit the bottom. No sound ever came, though, making him back away a few steps in fear. The last thing he remembered was going to bed that night. So how had he gotten here, and what was that thing that was chasing him? More importantly was the question of where did it go? Sitting down on the ground, Dylan tried to catch his breath, reaching up to place a hand on the gash across his forehead. The bleeding had slowed, but he knew he at least had a concussion. He tucked his head between his knees and waited for the nausea to pass. He wanted to call for help, but his phone was not in the pocket of his sleep pants. It must still be on the bedside table back at home. He had no idea how he was ever going to get back. For a moment, he considered if it would be safer to face the cliff or the forest monster. Neither option seemed like a good idea. Standing up, he decided to look for a different way out. Maybe there was a path he could take that would lead him away from the creature and back to a road. As he stood up, his vision blurred and the shaking returned. This time the shaking was in his head. It vibrated, causing him to convulse with every pulse. He hit the ground, landing on his stomach. His head felt like it might completely split in two. Not able to take the pain, he let out an ear-piercing scream before finally everything went dark. He collapsed, his face landing in the muddy grass beneath him. When he finally woke up, he realized the ground was a lot softer and drier than before. Carefully sliding his hands up toward his chest, he noticed something odd. His fingers got caught up in blankets? What the? He said before suddenly sitting up on what was actually his bed. He ran his hands all along the silk sheets, confused. His face had been buried on the pillow, and there was a wet spot where he had been drooling in his sleep. A dream? It was all just a bad dream? He said to himself, realization dawning on him. He laughed to himself when he realized he lived in Kansas, and there weren't exactly an abundance of forests and cliffs nearby. He glanced over at the clock, seeing the numbers blink 10 a.m. He had slept in by accident. Normally, he was an early morning person. Throwing the blanket off, he headed to the bathroom to brush his teeth and shake the fog out of his mind. Reaching up to open the medicine cabinet above the sink, something caught his eye in the mirror. There, just above his right eyebrow, was a large bloody gash. He touched it, causing it to sting and his eyes to water. Running back to his room, he checked his sheets again. The puddle he had thought was drool was actually a deep red color. He hadn't noticed it before because his sheets were a dark maroon, slightly hiding the blood. Panicking, he yanked the sheets from the mattress, throwing them out in the hallway, not wanting to see them. "This can't be happening. I'm losing my mind. Snap out of it, Dylan," he said to himself. His frantic mind tried to search for a reasonable, logical explanation to all this. He picked up the tossed sheets and took them to the laundry room. As he went to throw them in the washing machine, he noticed something on the floor. There sat his favorite pair of tennis shoes. They were completely covered in mud and gunk. He tried to remember the last time that he'd worn them. He knew that he hadn't gotten them dirty, and if he had, he would have cleaned them up. Snatching them off the floor, he threw them in with the sheets and slammed the washer's lid closed. At this point, he didn't care if it tore them up or ruined his sheets. He just couldn't look at them anymore. Dylan found his phone where he had left it on his bedside table. Not knowing what else to do, he called his sister. She was a nurse that worked at the trauma hospital. He knew she could help him clean up his head and might even be able to tell him what was going on. He didn't want to go to the hospital and have to explain or answer questions he didn't even have an answer for. She sounded agitated when she answered the phone, but agreed to come right over when she heard just how upset he sounded. He sat on the end of his bed on an empty mattress and waited for her to show up. Every noise seemed to make him jump. He would glance around searching for those familiar red eyes, only to feel stupid when every time there was nothing. Kate, his sister, had a key to his apartment he had given her in case of emergencies. She let herself in now, calling out his name as she came in. "Dylan, it's okay. I'm here. Where are you at?" He called back to her from the bedroom, not bothering to move from his spot. She came in with a medical bag slung over her shoulder and a concerned look on her face. "Dylan, you look like crap. What happened to you?" She dropped the bag on the floor beside him and flashed a light into his eyes, examining him. Dylan shrugged his shoulders. He still wasn't even sure what was real at the moment. He kept thinking that at any moment now, he would wake up on the cold, wet ground somewhere. He barely heard as Kate spoke to him, never bothering to reply. He could feel her hands working at his head, cleaning and dressing the gash. It wasn't until she started shaking him and yelling his name did he snap out of it. He could see tears in the corner of her eyes. "Dylan, you must have a concussion. You're really out of it. You need a hospital, not a nurse. Just what happened? Please tell me." Dylan furrowed his brows trying to explain it, but not coming up with anything. So he replied with, "I had a really bad dream, and then I woke up like this." Kate looked at him, waiting for him to say more, but nothing else came. Sighing, she gave him a hug, comforting him. Kate was the older of the two, and had always been protective of her baby brother. "Okay, you don't need to be alone tonight. So after my shift at work, I'm gonna come stay with you. If you start to have a bad dream, I'll come wake you up. You know I'm a light sleeper, so I hear if anything happens, alright?" Dylan silently agreed. His sister was the lightest sleeper he knew. She would either stay up all night worried about him, or she would wake up the moment anything happened. He instantly felt better knowing that tonight, he wouldn't be alone. Maybe between the two of them, they could get to the bottom of what was going on. He looked up at her and smiled, feeling better. Kate went through how to properly care for yourself after a concussion, and then practically shoved pain pills down his throat. When they finally went to say goodbye, he was actually feeling somewhat normal again. Shoving the dream aside, he watched his sister as she left, closing the door behind her. As he went to close it though, his eyes played a mean trick on him. Kate's dark brown eyes flashed a bright red briefly as he closed the door. Dylan suddenly slammed it closed, trying to ignore what he had just seen. He pinched his eyes shut, shaking his head back and forth like he was trying to erase the image. Kate had mentioned something about the possibility of hallucinations after head trauma. That had to be it. The blow to his head must have caused him to see things. There was no way a person would ever have red eyes. Dylan allowed the logic side of his brain to take over, relaxing him and returning his pulse to normal. Maybe it was best if he just tried to have a nice, peaceful day. Watch a little TV, eat some junk food, and wait for Kate to get off work. Just gonna be a nice, lazy day. Nothing crazy going on here. I could see if there are any movies or something. He talked to himself calmly, all the way to the living room where he plopped down on the couch and began channel surfing. There were a few old-time movies on, but he had never liked black and white, so he kept flipping before finding the news. A red banner flashed across the screen declaring that a woman had been found dead, her throat slashed open. Dylan didn't think much of it at first until a picture of the woman came across the screen. She was young and pretty, but what Dylan couldn't help but notice was the bright red eyes glaring at him from her photograph. He clamped his hands over his eyes, throwing the remote to the ground. With each beat of his heart, the TV seemed to grow louder and louder. Uncovering his eyes, he decided to see what else the news article had to say about the woman. Yet when he looked at the TV screen, it was black. It had turned off when the clicker hit the floor. Realizing this, the loud voices he had been hearing suddenly disappeared. When Kate got to her brother's house that night, she found him in the fetal position in front of the off television. He barely looked at her as she came in, acting like he couldn't hear anything. It was late, so she decided to get him to bed and keep an eye on him for the rest of the night. She threw the spare sheets from his closet onto the bed, all the time noticing how he watched her. Every few seconds or so, Dylan would look up at her eyes like he was searching for something. Occasionally, she would say something that would get a one-word answer out of him, usually something like, "Sure," or "Okay." She finally coaxed him into bed as gently as possible and stepped out into the hall. She leaned against the door with tears in her eyes and made a phone call. She called a psychiatrist she knew from work and asked for help. The doctor asked if she could bring Dylan in first thing in the morning so that he could talk to him, assuring her that it could just be a minor breakdown and not over-worry herself until they knew more. Kate agreed to this, thinking that he might be back to normal in the morning after getting a good night's rest. Dylan could hear his sister's phone call as he lay in his bed. At first, he wanted to be mad. He wasn't crazy. He had no history of mental illness. However, the events of the last 24 hours had told him that maybe it wouldn't hurt to talk to someone. He had heard stories of people having dreams while they were awake. He had even heard stories of the government having some kind of secret medicine that stopped you from dreaming. Something told him that if such a thing existed, it wouldn't be so bad to get his hands on it, to stop the monster and whatever it was doing. He stretched out in the bed and closed his eyes, muttering to himself, "It was just a dream. It's over. I can go to sleep. It's safe now. I am safe now." Again and again, he whispered reassurance to himself, hoping this would relax him enough to sleep. With the worry of his head injury and his current state, he knew his sister would be wide awake listening to his every move, making sure that he was fine, and this thought settled him enough that he finally drifted off into a deep sleep. A few hours later, Dylan woke up to the sound of a movie coming from the living room. Deciding he could use a drink of water, he made his way into the room to check on his sister. From behind, he could see her long blonde hair splayed across the back of the couch. The movie was some old love story he knew she had seen 1,000 times. At the sound of his footsteps, she turned to look at him. Dylan's blood ran cold when his eyes met hers. They were a bright, glowing red, again matching those of the monsters perfectly. "What's wrong?" She stood to walk towards him, and he noticed that she was suddenly much bigger than before, standing up to tower over him as black shadows seemed to melt off the walls and circle around her. Slowly, he could see the monster taking form, taking over her body and becoming the thing he had seen in the woods. The sharp claws reaching out to him, and he backed up, knocking into the wall. A large growl came from its mouth, revealing razor-sharp fangs where every single tooth had once been. Dylan reached down and pinched himself, feeling how it actually hurt. "You're dreaming. Wake up, wake up, wake up!" He screamed at himself, but to no avail. Opening his eyes, all he could see was the monster staring back at him and laughing in its dog-like voice. He slammed his head back into the wall over and over, hoping that it would wake him from his nightmare. Realizing it wasn't going to work, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He ran. He made it up and over the back of the couch, slipping past the creature and out the front door. He landed flat on his face in what appeared to be the same forest all over again. He looked behind him to see his house had disappeared. This time, the creature moved slowly and deliberately, not bothering to chase him as he got up and sprinted toward the deepest part of the woods. Occasionally, he could hear it taunting him, calling out to him in his sister's voice. "Dylan, come back," it would say. "It's okay, Dylan. Stop running. You're safe." He hated it for lying, for using her voice. He knew in his mind that his sister was gone. The creature must have gotten her while he slept. She should have never stayed the night with him. It only put her directly in the monster's path. He cried while he ran, not bothering to look where he was going. He knew that he would die, that he too would simply cease to exist like Kate did. As he came crashing into the clearing by the cliff, he saw something that could change his chances of survival. There, sitting in the grass of the clearing, was what appeared to be a sharp hunting knife. Dylan snatched it up and turned to face the monster, his back towards the cliff. If he was going to die today, then he was at least going to go down fighting. The thing saw that he had stopped moving and picked up pace in his direction, running right for him. Hiding the knife behind his back, he waited for the right moment. Once the creature was in arm's length, he stabbed it directly where Kate's heart had once been. Feeling the knife go into it like soft butter, he watched as the shadows started to scatter back into the darkness. There on the ground, where the creature had been, lay his sister. Scooping her up into his arms, Dylan held her close to his chest. It was then that he realized that she was still breathing, the knife embedded directly in her chest. "Dylan, it's just a dream. You're sleepwalking," she managed to choke out as blood trickled from her mouth. As she took her last breath, the clearing disappeared from around them, revealing his kitchen. Kate laid lifeless in his arms, and inside her chest was the knife that he had used to clean fish with. No sign of the monster anywhere. Dylan screamed, dropping her to the ground and sliding away from her into the cabinets behind them. Blood stained his hands, and he knew what he had done. Sleepwalking. Kate had said he had been sleepwalking, which meant none of it had been real. No monster, no forest, no threat to his life. Hands shaking and voice cracking, he called 911, knowing that there was nothing they could do to save her at this point. He didn't bother to move from his spot as the police and paramedics wandered around his house, taking pictures and collecting evidence. He admitted everything to the officers, not bothering to lie. He had killed his sister, and no telling who else he would kill if given the chance. He belonged behind bars. It would make the world a better place. One of the officers placed him in the back of the squad car, shaking his head sadly at him. Dylan could tell he actually pitied him and what had happened. Dylan still just felt numb to it all, like he was still waiting to wake up. "It's going to be all right," the officer said from the front seat. "We will get you some help, man." Dylan looked up at the kind man in the rearview mirror and tried to form words, but nothing came out. He just looked back down at his muddy boots, defeated. It was then that he realized he was wearing muddy shoes. He had obviously gone to bed not wearing any. With this realization, a familiar growl-like laugh rang out from the seat in front of him. He looked up to see the same shadowy shape and red eyes. Looking out the window of the squad car, he once again saw trees. Somehow, managing to get the door open, Dylan rolled out, still handcuffed, and then he ran, his shoes slipping on the wet ground as he flew by. Hey there, friends. I hope you enjoyed that video, that story. The story was, once again, The Cliff by Alysha Wilson. Alysha is a fantastic author and, in my opinion, very talented, and wrote a very good cyclical story here, honestly. One that really picks at the brain because, as quick as the situation was to unfold, it definitely got bad fast. Yeah, if you enjoyed that story and you want more content like this, please consider joining the Nevermore. The Nevermore consists of being a subscriber to my channel. You can also access things like my Patreon, my Ko-fi, my Twitter, subreddit, Facebook, and my merch store if you so choose to do so. You can also access all those without subscribing, but why would you want to? I mean, it's more fun, right, to be subscribed and wear a t-shirt that says As the Raven Dreams. That's just obvious, right? I'm bumbling here, people. I'm just kind of randomly talking about things. All right. Have a fantastic day, guys. Have a fantastic week. I hope you're all doing well out there. And I'll see you on the next video. But until then, sleep well.